Section 23 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 5, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mary, Chapter 5, Part 3. It was the trial of Sir Nicholas Throckmorton which first brought the illegal proceedings of the Privy Council into popular notice, under the designation of the decrees of the Star Chamber, afterwards so infamous in English history. They had long been at work in the same way, but in the present instance, public attention had been peculiarly excited by Throckmorton's recitation of the Queen's eloquent charge to her judges, and indignation was raised to a high pitch when the jury were, after unjust imprisonment, threatened by the Star Chamber, and mulcted with heavy fines, while the acquitted prisoner was as unjustly detained in the Tower. As the Queen, at the intercession of his brother, set Sir Nicholas Throckmorton free, soon after, uninjured in person or estate, he considered he had had a fortunate escape. It is said that she finally remitted the fines of the worthy jury who had acquitted him, but it was alike degrading to a queen who wished to rule constitutionally, and to Englishmen whom the law had not declared guilty to give and receive pardons of the kind. The Queen was extremely ill, sick almost to death, at the time of Throckmorton's trial. The public, and even Renaud, attributed her indisposition to Throckmorton's acquittal, but the decided part taken by the Queen's confidential friend, Inglefield, in his favour, is a sure proof that the trial took a course not pleasing to her, however it might enrage her Privy Council. By the 5th of May, the Queen was sufficiently recovered to dissolve Parliament in person. She pronounced a speech from the throne, in presence of her assembled peers and commons, which excited so much enthusiasm that she was 5 or 6 times interrupted by loud shouts of "Long live the Queen!" and at the same time many persons present turned away and wept. Such was the description given by Basset, one of the royal attendants present, to Renaud, and the courtly reporter attributed these emotions to her Majesty's eloquence. It is to be hoped that those who wept were mourning over the deep degradation of the national character, since the House of Peers, which had unanimously joined in establishing the Protestant Church of England 4 short years before, now, to the exultation of the Spanish ambassador, as unanimously agreed in enacting, that the ancient penalties against heretics should be enforced, classing as heretics the members of the very church they had so recently planted. This House of Peers consisted of about 50 laymen, who were, with the exception of 5 or 6 persons, the very same individuals who had altered religion in the preceding reign. It is true that the spiritual peers who sat among them were Catholic instead of Protestant bishops, yet, had the lay peers been honest or consistent, a very strong majority might have prevailed against the enactment of cruel penal laws for the prosecution of a church they had lately founded, but they were not honest, for Renaud plumed himself on the emperor's success in bribing the most influential of their body. William Thomas was hung at Tyburn on the 18th of May. He had been clerk to the Privy Council of Edward VI, and had been very urgent with the rebels to destroy the life of Mary, if she fell in their power. He was the last of the victims executed for participation in Wyatt's insurrection, for the Queen had pardoned her kinsman, Lord John Grey, likewise Sir James Crofts, and Admiral Winter, although the 2 last had been each the leader of a separate revolt. Nor did she exercise this privilege of her high station without much murmuring from Renaud. This minister of mercilessness announced to his master, the emperor, that all the judges had pronounced that if brought to trial, the proofs against Courtenay were such as to ensure his condemnation to death, if the Queen could be prevailed on to give him up to it, but besides her impracticability in his favour, her trusted servant, Sir Robert Rochester, was the staunch friend of both Courtenay and Elisabeth, and wished for their union, and that the Queen trusted Lord William Howard implicitly with her ships, who made no scruple of avowing his friendship for Elisabeth, although Mary's partisans expected he would one day revolt with the whole fleet. The Queen showed greatness of mind in her implicit reliance in Rochester and Howard, malgré all these insinuations. She knew that they had proved true as steel in the hour of her distress, and it is most evident, by the result, that she did not consider them as enemies, because they pleaded for her unfortunate relatives. The day succeeding the execution of William Thomas, the Princess Elizabeth was liberated from her confinement in the Tower, and sent by water to Richmond Palace, and from thence to Woodstock, where she remained under some restraint. Part of the queen's household guards, under the command of Bedingfeld, had charge of her. About the same time, Courtenay was sent to Fotheringay Castle, likewise under guard, though not continued closely. In the same important week arrived Don Juan Figueroa, a Spanish grandee of the first class. He was designated, in a private letter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, as the ancient ambassador, with the long grey beard, who was here when the late King Edward died. His errand was to be ready in England for the reception of Prince Philip. The emperor had deputed this nobleman to invest the prince, at his marriage, with the kingdom of Naples, in order to render him equal in dignity with his spouse. The Lord Admiral Howard had sailed from Portsmouth with the finest ships of the Queen's navy, to join the united fleets of Spain and the Netherlands, that Prince Philip might be escorted to his bride with the utmost maritime pomp. On the appointment of Howard to this command, the emperor's ambassador offered him a pension, as a token of the prince's gratitude. He referred him to the queen, who gave him leave for its acceptance, but it had not the least effect on the Lord Admiral's independence, for his national combativeness rose at the sight of the foreign fleets, and Renaud sent a dispatch, full of complaints, to the emperor, saying, that the Lord Admiral Howard had spoken with great scorn of the Spanish ships, and irreverently compared them to mussel shells. Moreover, he quarrelled with the Spanish ambassador, and held him very cheap. He added, that the English sailors elbowed and pushed the Spanish ones whenever they met on shore, with which rudeness the Lord Admiral was by no means displeased. And, had it not been for the extreme forbearance of the Spanish admiral, in preventing his men from going on shore during the month the combined fleets were waiting for Queen Mary's spouse, the English would have picked a quarrel and given their allies battle royal. To add to all these affronts, Lord Admiral Howard forced the Prince of Spain's ships to do the maritime homage the English fleet always insisted on, as sovereigns of the narrow seas, by striking topsails in the Channel, though the prince was on board in person. Philip had continued until the middle of May at Valladolid, governing Spain as regent, for his distracted grandmother, the queen regnant Joanna. Queen Mary had written to him a French letter, commencing with the words, Monsieur mon bon et perpetuel Ali, in which she announced to him the consent of her parliament to their marriage. The letter is worded with great formality, and assumes the character of England writing to Spain, rather than Queen Mary to her betrothed husband. Yet she could scarcely adopt a different tone, since the prince had sedulously avoided writing to her, as may be gathered from the reiterated remonstrances of Renaud on this subject, even at so late a date as the 28th of April, 1554, 6 days after the dispatch of Queen Mary's letter. At the end of May, the bridegroom made a farewell visit to the royal maniac whose sceptre he swayed. To save time, his sister, the Princess Dowager of Portugal, met him by the way, and at the same time he bade her adieu, and resigned into her hands the government of Spain. He arrived at Corunna at the latter end of June, and, after waiting some time for a favourable wind, finally embarked for England on the 13th of July. Mary and her council meantime retired to Richmond Palace, and sat in earnest debate regarding the reception of Don Philip, and the station he was to occupy in England. Unfortunately, Mary had no precedent to guide her in distinguishing between her duties as queen regnant and the submission and obedience the marriage vow enforced from her as a wife. It is true that she was the granddaughter of Isabel of Castile, the greatest and best queen that ever swayed an independent sceptre, but then, on the other side, she was granddaughter to the undoubted heiress of England, Elizabeth of York, who had afforded her the example of an utter surrender of all her rights to the will of her husband. It is very evident that Queen Mary considered that her duty, both as a married woman and a sedulous observer of the established customs of her country, was, as far as possible, to yield implicit obedience to her spouse. All the crimes, all the detestation with which the memory of that unfortunate lady has been loaded certainly arose, not from intentional wickedness, but from this notion. The first question on which the queen and her council came to issue was, whether, in the regal titles, her name should precede that of her husband. On this point Renaud became very earnest. "I told the chancellor," he wrote to the emperor, "that neither divine nor human law could surrender his highness to be named last." The result was that the queen yielded precedence to the titular dignity of Philip. Her next desire was to obtain for him the distinction of a coronation as king, but on this point Gardiner and her council were resolute. She had, they said, been crowned, and received their oaths, with all the ceremonies pertaining to the kings, her ancestors, and what more could be needed? Mary then expressed her wish that her wedded lord might be crowned with the diadem of the queen consorts of England, but that was negatived. She was forced to content herself by providing for him a collar and mantle of the garter, worth £2000, with which he was to be invested the moment he touched English ground. She spent the remainder of June at Guildford Palace, in order to be near the southern ports. In the middle of July, before tidings were heard of the approach of the combined fleets, when the queen dispatched Russell, Lord Privy Seal, to receive Philip, who was expected at Southampton, Mary gave her envoy the following instructions, which afford an ominous instance of the future sway that Philip was to bear, through her, in the government of England. Instructions for my Lord Privy Seal. First tell the king the whole state of the realm, with all things pertaining to the same, as much as ye know to be true. Second, to obey his commandment in all things. Thirdly, in all things he shall ask your advice, to declare your opinion, as becometh a faithful counsellor to do. Mary the Queen. The day before the royal cortege departed for Winchester, the book containing the list of the queen's attendants was brought before the Privy Council and carefully scanned by Gardiner and Arundel, when the following odd dialogue took place, whilst they were examining the list of the gentlemen-at-arms, presented to them by the lieutenant, Sir Humphrey Ratcliffe, when they came to the name of Edward Underhill, the hot gospeller, to whose journal this biography has been so much indebted. "What doth he here?" said Arundel. "Because he is an honest man, because he hath served Queen Mary from the beginning, and fought so well for her at Wyatt's rebellion," answered Sir Humphrey Ratcliffe. "Let him pass then," said Gardiner. "He is an arch heretic, nevertheless," rejoined Arundel. The carriage which conveyed the queen's ladies on this bridal expedition was a very droll vehicle, and, redolent as it was with red paint, must have surpassed the splendour of a modern wild beast show. It is graphically described in one of Mary's own royal orders, as follows: "We command you, on the sight hereof, to deliver to our well-beloved Edmund Standen, clerk of our stable, one waggon of timber work, with wheels, axle-trees, and benches, and fine red cloth to cover the said waggon, fringed with red silk, and lined with red buckram. The waggon to be painted outside with red, also collar, draughts, and harness of red leather. A hammer cloth, with our arms and badges of our colours, and all things pertaining to the said waggon, which is for the ladies and gentlewomen of our privy chamber." The queen was at Windsor Castle when the tidings arrived, that Don Philip and the combined fleets of England and Spain, amounting to 160 sail, had made the port at Southampton, Friday, July 20th, after a favourable voyage from Corunna of but 7 days. The queen and her bridal retinue the next day set out for Winchester, where she had resolved her nuptials should be celebrated, not by the unfortunate Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, whose right it was to perform the ceremony, but by her prime minister, Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester. She made her public entry into Winchester on Monday, July 23rd, in the midst of a furious storm of rain and wind, and took up her abode in the episcopal palace, which had been prepared for her reception. In the meantime, Don Philip landed on the 20th of July. He was rowed on shore in a magnificent state barge, manned by 20 men, dressed in the queen's liveries of green and white. The barge was lined with rich tapestry, and a seat was provided for the prince, covered with gold brocade. Mary had sent this vessel to meet her spouse, attended by 20 other barges, lined with striped cloth, which were to accommodate, with due regard to their several dignities, his Spanish officers of state. Among these were more than one historical character. The Duke of Alva, afterwards infamous for his cruelties to the Protestants in the Netherlands, was the principal in rank, as Philip's major domo. When the prince ascended the stairs leading to the mole at Southampton, he found a deputation from the queen and a great concourse of nobles and gentry waiting to receive him. He was immediately presented with the order of the Garter, which was buckled below his knee, by the Earl of Arundel when he first set foot on English ground. He was likewise invested with a mantle of blue velvet, fringed with gold and pearl. The queen had sent, by her master of horse, a beautiful jennet for the prince's use, who immediately mounted it and rode it to the church of the Holy Rood at Southampton, where he returned thanks for his safe voyage. From thence he was conducted to a very fine palace, in which an apartment was prepared for him, with a canopy and chair of state of crimson velvet, gold and pearl. The room was hung with some of Henry VIII's best arras, figured with white and crimson and gold flowers, and bordered with the titles of that monarch, in which the words "Defender of the Faith and Head of the Church" seem to have made a remarkable impression on the minds of Philip's attendants. The prince was dressed simply in black velvet. He wore a beret cap of the same, passamented with small gold chains. A little feather drooped on the right side. There are letters and descriptions extant, which wonderfully commend his beauty of face and figure, but his numerous original pictures do not bear out such assertions. His complexion being cane-colored, his hair sandy and scanty, his eyes small, blue, and weak, with a gloomy expression of face, which is peculiarly odious in a person of very light complexion. A high volume of brain, although it sloped too much towards the top of the head, denoted that this unpleasant-looking prince was a man of considerable abilities. The following day, being Friday, Don Philip went to mass, accompanied by many English nobles, to whom he behaved courteously, and gave much satisfaction, excepting only, they remarked, that he never raised his beret cap. The weather had set in with an incessant downpouring of wet, such as an English July only is capable of. It was a cruel rain, says the Italian narrator, on the Saturday, through which Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, came to welcome Don Philip, accompanied by 50 gentlemen, with rich gold chains about their necks, dressed in black velvet, passamented with gold, and 100 other gentlemen in black cloth, barred with gold. The Duchess of Alva landed in the evening, and was carried on shore in a chair of black velvet, borne by 4 of her gentlemen. Don Philip dispatched the following morning his grand chamberlain, Don Ruy Gomez de Silva, with a magnificent offering of jewels, of the value of 50,000 ducats, as a present to his royal bride. That day being Sunday, after mass he dined in public, and was waited upon by his newly appointed English officers of the household, to the great chagrin of his Spanish attendants, most of whom were, according to the marriage treaty, obliged to return with the Spanish fleet. Don Philip courted popularity. He told his new attendants, in Latin, that he was come to live among them like an Englishman, and, in proof thereof, drank some ale for the first time, which he gravely commended, as the wine of the country. In the midst of a cruel wind and downpouring rain, on the Monday morning, the royal bridegroom and his suite mounted their steeds, and set out in grand state and solemn cavalcade to Winchester, where the queen and her court waited for them. The Earl of Pembroke had arrived the same morning as their escort, with 250 cavaliers, superbly mounted, dressed in black velvet, and wearing heavy gold chains. A party of 100 archers, with their bows ready, came on horseback, dressed in yellow cloth, striped with red velvet, and wearing cordons of white and crimson silk, being the colours of the prince. 4,000 spectators, variously mounted, whom curiosity had brought together, closed the procession. Don Philip was, as usual, dressed in black velvet, but, on account of the heavy rain, he wore over all a red felt cloak and a large black hat. When the cavalcade had progressed about 2 miles from Southampton, the prince met a gentleman, riding post, who presented him with a small ring, as a token from the queen, and prayed him, in her name, to advance no further. Philip, who did not very well understand his language, and knew the violent resistance the English had made to his espousing their queen, apprehended immediately that she meant to warn him of some impending danger, and, calling Alva and Egmont apart, drew up, in consternation, by the roadside, for a consultation; when an English lord, seeing there was some misapprehension, immediately said, in French, "Sire, our queen lovingly greets your highness, and has merely sent to say, that she hopes you will not commence your journey to Winchester in such dreadful weather." When the prince rightly comprehended the queen's message, he gallantly resolved to persevere in his journey, and his line of march again moved forward on the Winchester road, but did not progress far, before another cavalier was encountered bearing a long white wand in his hand, who, addressing the prince in Latin, informed him, that he had the command of the county, and entreated his leave to perform his office. This being granted, the gentleman turned his horse, and raising his wand on high, and taking off his cap, preceded the cavalcade, the rain pouring on his bare head the whole way, though the prince repeatedly entreated him to be covered. About a mile from Winchester, 2 noblemen from the queen came to meet the prince, attended by 6 of the royal pages, attired in cloth of gold, and mounted on great Flemish coursers, trapped with the same. Although Southampton is but 10 miles from Winchester, the cavalcade moved with such Spanish gravity and deliberation, that it was between 6 and 7 o'clock before Don Philip arrived at the city gate, where, says the Italian narrator, 8 first-rate officials were stationed, clothed in scarlet gowns, who swore fidelity to the prince. These worthies were no other than the mayor and aldermen of Winchester, who presented Don Philip with the keys of the city, which he returned. A great volley of artillery was shot off as he entered the city, and 12 persons from the queen, dressed in red, with gold on their breasts, probably beefeaters, conducted him to a palace, not very superbly ornamented. It was, indeed, the Dean of Winchester's house, where Philip sojourned till after his marriage. There the prince altered his dress. He wore hose and nether stocks, of white and silver, and a superb black velvet robe, bordered with diamonds. Thus attired, he went first to the cathedral, where Gardiner received him, in full pontificals, accompanied by many priests, singing Te Deum, and after prayers, conducted him through the cloisters, back to the dean's house. The queen's first interview with her affianced husband took place that evening, about 10 o'clock, when Don Philip was conducted privately to the bishop's palace. Mary received him right lovingly, and conversed with him familiarly in Spanish for about half an hour, when he went back to the deanery. The queen held a grand court, at 3 o'clock the next afternoon, when she gave Don Philip a public audience. He came on foot from the deanery, attended by the Lord High Steward, the Earl of Derby, the Earl of Pembroke, likewise with some of his Spanish grandees, and their wives. He was dressed in black and silver, and adorned with the insignia of the Garter. The royal minstrels met him, and played before him, and the people shouted, "God save your grace!" He was thus conducted in great state to the hall of the bishop's palace, where the queen advanced, as far as the entrance, to receive him, and kissed him in the presence of the whole multitude. She led him to the presence chamber, where they both stood under the canopy of state, and conversed together before all the courtiers. At evensong he withdrew from the presence chamber, and attended service at the cathedral, from whence he was conducted, by torchlight, to his residence at the deanery. The morrow, being the 25th of July, and the festival of St. James, the patron saint of Spain, had been appointed for the royal nuptials. A raised causeway, covered with red serge, leading to 2 thrones in the choir, had been prepared for the marriage procession. Queen Mary walked on foot from the episcopal palace, attended by her principal nobility and ladies, her train being borne by her cousin, Margaret Douglas, assisted by the chamberlain, Sir John Gage. She met her bridegroom in the choir, and they took their seats in the chairs of state, an altar being erected between them. Gardiner came in great state, assisted by Bonner, Bishop of London, and the Bishops of Durham, Chichester, Lincoln, and Ely, with their croziers borne before them. Philip was attended to the altar by 60 Spanish grandees and cavaliers, among whom were Alva, Medina, Egmont, and Pescara. He was dressed in a robe of rich brocade, bordered with large pearls and diamonds. His trunk hose were of white satin, worked with silver. He wore a collar of beaten gold, full of inestimable diamonds, at which hung the jewel of the golden fleece. At his knee was the garter, studded with beautiful colored gems. The ceremony was preceded by a solemn oration from Figueroa, regent of Naples, who declared, that his imperial master, Charles V., having contracted a marriage between the Queen of England and his chief jewel, being his son and heir, Philip, Prince of Spain, in order to make the parties equal, had resigned his kingdom of Naples, so that Queen Mary married a king and not a prince. Figueroa then asked in a loud voice, if there were any persons who knew any lawful impediment between the contracting parties; if so, they might then come forth and be heard. The marriage, which was both in Latin and English, proceeded, till it came to the part of the ceremony where the bride is given. The question was then asked, who was to give her? And it seems to have been a puzzling one, not provided for. When the Marquess of Winchester, the Earls of Derby, Bedford, and Pembroke came forward and gave her, in the name of the whole realm. Upon which the people gave a great shout and prayed God to send them joy. The wedding ring was laid on the book, to be hallowed. Some discussion had previously taken place in council regarding this ring, which the queen decided by declaring she would not have it adorned with gems, for she chose to be wedded with a plain hoop of gold, like any other maiden. King Philip laid on the book 3 handfuls of fine gold coins and some silver ones. When the lady Margaret Douglas saw this, she opened the queen's purse, and her majesty was observed to smile on her as she put the bridal gold within it. Directly the hand of Queen Mary was given to King Philip, the Earl of Pembroke advanced and carried a sword of state before the bridegroom, which he had hitherto kept out of sight. The royal pair returned hand in hand from the high altar. They seated themselves again in their chairs of state, where they remained till mass was concluded. At the proper period of the mass, Philip rose from his place, and went to the queen, and gave her the kiss of peace, for such was the custom. The titles of the royal pair were then proclaimed in Latin and English, after which, sops and wine were hallowed and served to them, of which they took part, and all their noble attendants. Don Philip then took the queen's hand, and led her to the episcopal palace. Both walked, when they returned from their marriage, under one canopy. The queen always took the right hand. The ceremonial in the cathedral lasted from 11 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. The queen was dressed at her marriage in the French style, in a robe richly brocade on a gold ground, with a long train splendidly bordered with pearls and diamonds of great size. The large rebras sleeves were turned up with clusters of gold set with pearls and diamonds. Her chaperon or coif was bordered with 2 rows of large diamonds. The close gown or kirtle worn beneath the robe was of white satin, wrought with silver. On her breast the queen wore the remarkable diamond of inestimable value, sent to her as a gift from King Philip, whilst he was still in Spain, by the Marquis de los Naves. So far the dress was in good taste, but the addition of scarlet shoes and brodequins, and a black velvet scarf, added to this costume by the royal bride, can scarcely be considered improvements. The chair on which Queen Mary sat is still shown at Winchester Cathedral. Report says it was a present from Rome, and was blessed by the Pope. The hall of the episcopal palace in which the bridal banquet was spread was hung with arras striped with gold and silk. It had a stately dais raised at the upper end, ascended by 4 steps. The seats for Queen Mary and her spouse were placed on this, under one canopy, before which their dinner table was set. Below the dais was spread various tables, where the queen's ladies, the Spanish grandees, their wives, and the English nobility were feasted. Bishop Gardiner dined at the royal table, which was served with plate of solid gold, and a cupboard of 9 stages full of gold vases and silver dishes was placed in full view, for ornament rather than use. In a gallery opposite was placed a band of admirable musicians, who played a sweet concert, till 4 heralds entered, attired in their regal mantles, and, between the first and second courses, pronounced a congratulatory Latin oration in the name of the realm, likewise a panegyric in praise of holy matrimony. The Winchester boys had written Latin epithalamiums, which they recited, and were rewarded by the queen. After the banquet, King Philip returned thanks to the lords of the Privy Council and the other English nobility, and the queen spoke very graciously to the Spanish grandees and their noble ladies in their own language. The tables were taken up at 6 o'clock, and dancing commenced, but the whole gay scene was concluded at 9 o'clock, when the queen and King Philip retired from the ball. While these grand state festivals were proceeding, private grudges and quarrels were going forward among her majesty's Protestant and Catholic attendants. The hot gospeller, Mr. Edward Underhill, whose lively journal gives the best idea of the interior of the palace during the reign of our first queen regnant, was on duty in the presence chamber at Winchester, and performed his office of assisting in carrying up the dishes at the wedding banquet. He never chose to give up his post of guarding the queen's person, though his adversary, Norreys, who was promoted to the place of queen's usher, again renewed his persecutions. A day or 2 after the royal marriage, Norreys came from his station, at the door of the queen's private sitting room, into the presence chamber, when the gentlemen at arms all made reverence to him, as his place required. He fixed his eyes on Edward Underhill, and asked him, "What he did there?" "Marry, sir," replied the undaunted Protestant, "what do you do here?" "You are very short with me," observed Norreys. "I will forbear," rejoined Underhill, "out of respect for the place you be in. If you were of the outer chamber, I would be shorter with you. You were the doorkeeper when we waited at the queen's table. Your office is not to find fault with me for doing my duty. I am at this time appointed to serve her majesty by those who are in authority under her, who know me well." "They shall know you better," returned his foe, "and the queen also." Mr. Calverley, one of Underhill's comrades, brother to Sir John Calverley of Cheshire, then interposed, saying, "In good faith, Mr. Norreys, you do not well. This gentleman, our fellow, hath served Queen Mary a long time. He has been ever ready to venture his life in her service, and at the last troubles was as forward as any one to guard her. He is now appointed at very great charges, as we all are, to serve her again. Methinks you do more than the part of a gentleman to seek to discharge him." "Ye all hold together," growled Norreys. "Else we were worse than beasts," retorted Calverley. The master Norreys retreated, grumbling, to his post at the queen's door. If he ever carried his threats into execution, of telling tales to her majesty of the valiant hot gospeller, it is certain that he never succeeded in injuring him. The Spanish fleet sailed for the coast of Flanders the next day, having first landed 80 genets belonging to Don Philip, of such perfect beauty that they could not be surpassed. A number of Spaniards, to the amount of 4,000, who had intended to land in England with Don Philip, were extremely disappointed at finding that their presence was forbidden in the island by the queen's marriage articles. 400 or 500 persons, among whom were a number of fools and buffoons, belonging to the suites of the grandees of high rank, immediately attending on Don Philip, were permitted, however, to come on shore. This was the sole Spanish force that accompanied the queen's bridegroom. End of Section 23.